Frank Delaney sat quietly at Gate 27 in Denver International Airport, the soft hum of early morning activity barely reaching his ears. It was just past 6:30 a.m., and the terminal was still wrapped in the calm that comes before the rush of travelers. At 78 years old, Frank carried with him the measured patience of a lifetime shaped by discipline and duty. His tan jacket hung neatly over his shoulders, and his worn walking shoes tapped lightly against the floor as he shifted in place, hands folded carefully on his lap. The ache in his left knee was a constant companion, a reminder of battles fought long ago in distant lands. This was no ordinary discomfort caused by age, but the lasting imprint of a service injury that had shadowed him for decades. Frank had booked this flight months ago, planning his journey from Rock Springs, Wyoming to Annapolis, Maryland. The purpose was simple but profound: to witness his granddaughter graduate from the United States Naval Academy, the first in their family to don the uniform since he had. This was a milestone he would not miss no matter the cost. When the boarding call echoed through the terminal, Frank rose with careful steadiness, gripping the handrail as he navigated the jet bridge. His ticket read, Seat 14C, an aisle seat in premium economy, an intentional choice to ease the pressure on his injured knee. It wasn't a luxury, it was a necessity. The extra legroom and easy aisle access were essential for the 5-hour flight ahead. With quiet grace, he lowered himself into the seat, stowing his small duffel beneath the chair in front of him. The subtle relief was almost immediate, but just as he settled into the familiar rhythm of travel, a shadow passed over the cabin. A flight attendant named Kayla approached her, practiced smile poised yet tinged with urgency. She crouched slightly to speak with him, explaining that a family had been separated during booking. To seat them together, Frank's row and the seats beside him were the only available block. He would need to move. Frank's brow furrowed the weight of the request, pressing against more than just his body. This seat was reserved for his medical needs, paid for long ago with his fixed pension. Yet as the mother with 2 young children stood in the aisle, hope flickering in their eyes, Frank faced a quiet battle within himself. The loss of his seat was more than inconvenience. It was a deep fracture in dignity. After a tense silence, he nodded slowly and unbuckled his seatbelt. Rising stiffly, the scarred hands gripping the headrest, Frank spoke with calm resolve, introducing himself not just as a passenger, but as Staff Sergeant Frank Delaney, United States Marine Corps retired. He wanted it noted that he had relinquished his medically necessary seat under pressure. No words were needed beyond that. As he limped down the aisle towards seat 32B, a cramped middle seat near the rear, the cabin settled into an uneasy stillness. In that moment, Frank was more than a man moving through an aircraft. He was a symbol of sacrifice, resilience, and the quiet toll that service can take long after the battles have ended. The flight had begun, but for Frank Delaney, a journey much deeper was just unfolding. As the cabin lights dimmed and the engines thrummed softly, the fragile balance of respect and obligation hung in the air, waiting to be tested. In the quiet moments before takeoff, Frank Delaney settled into seat 32B, the cramped middle spot wedged between 2 strangers he would never meet. The soft hum of the engines began to fill the cabin as passengers adjusted, but for Frank, the discomfort was immediate and unyielding. His left knee, already stiff and swollen from years of injury, throbbed sharply against the limited space. There was no aisle to lean on, no extra legroom to ease the pressure, only the hard reminder that this was not where he had planned to be. Around him, the world moved on without notice. The college student, who his right headphones on, was lost in a movie, oblivious to the man struggling beside him. On his left, a businessman typed intently on a laptop, elbows sprawling into Frank's shrinking personal space. Neither offered a glance or an ounce of kindness. Frank's hands rested quietly in his lap, thick knuckles clenched just enough to hold back the pain he refused to voice. This was a familiar feeling, being unseen, overlooked, and quietly endured. Yet across the aisle, 3 rows ahead, Charlotte Hayes watched with growing concern. A woman in her 40s with sharp eyes and a steady presence, Charlotte had boarded just before Frank and sensed the unfolding injustice. She had overheard the conversation between Frank and the flight attendant, the request, the reluctant compliance. She saw the way Frank's face tightened as he tried to mask the discomfort. She noticed his scarred hands, evidence of a life far harder than this cramped cabin could reveal. Unable to stay silent, Charlotte reached for her phone and typed a brief message to a friend in the airline's customer relations. The words were simple but urgent. Passenger Frank Delaney, forced to give up medically necessary seat 14C, now in 32B. Crew dismissive. Please escalate. She hesitated only a moment before hitting send, then turned her gaze back to Frank, who sat still as the plane's gentle vibrations hummed through the cabin. Time seemed to stretch as the flight attendants completed their checks, passing by without a word or apology. No one offered Frank assistance or acknowledgement. The solitude deepened not just in the physical space, but in the silence of neglect. Yet despite the aching knee and the shrinking space, Frank remained composed, shoulders squared, eyes closed against the sting of loneliness. The cabin buzzed with quiet conversations and the rustle of belongings, but in that corner an invisible line had been drawn between those who noticed and those who chose not to. Charlotte's message was a small act of defiance in a sea of indifference, a seed of hope planted amid the growing tension. As the engines roared to life and the plane began its taxi, Frank's mind drifted to memories far removed from cramped airline seats. The steady beat of boots on foreign soil, the voice of comrades in the heat of battle, the moment his knee shattered under fire. Those memories throbbed like the pain in his leg, a quiet testament to sacrifice that few around him could understand. Unseen by most, a change was stirring, one that would soon ripple through the cabin, challenging the quiet acceptance of discomfort and demanding that respect be restored. The wheels of the plane kissed the runway at Annapolis, Maryland, with a gentle hum, sunlight streaming through the windows like a quiet benediction. Frank Delaney remained seated in 1A hands, resting calmly on his knees, the weight of the morning's events settling within him. He was no longer just a passenger. He was a man restored, seen at last in a way that transcended the cramped confines of an airplane seat. As passengers rose to gather their belongings, Frank's granddaughter stood near the baggage claim, dressed in her midshipman's uniform, the sharp crease of her trousers mirroring the pride in her eyes. She held a handmade sign that read, "Welcome, Grandpa Frank." When she saw him limping toward her, the sign fell forgotten to the floor, and she ran to wrap him in an embrace full of warmth and relief. "Your knees," she whispered, concern etched in her voice. Frank smiled gently, a smile that reached the depths of his eyes. "I've had worse," he replied softly, his voice steady, despite the ache. They sat together for hours that afternoon, talking quietly about her studies, her ship placement, and the plans she dreamed of after commissioning. When she asked about the flight, confused by the flurry of texts and news alerts, Frank kept it simple. "I had a bad seat," he said with a small chuckle. But the story had already begun to spread. A video recorded by a fellow passenger, Captain Miller's heartfelt apology over the intercom, circulated online, touching hearts far beyond the cabin. Tears welled in his granddaughter's eyes as she watched. Then she hugged Frank again, holding on as if to anchor him in the moment. Days later, a letter arrived from Transcontinental Airlines. Inside, a formal apology accompanied a full refund and a card that read, "Dear Mr. Delaney, as of today, you are designated a lifetime guest of honor with Transcontinental Airlines. No booking codes, no fees. Just tell us where you're going, and we'll get you there." Frank folded the letter carefully, placing it beside a small flag in his study. The silence that followed filled with unspoken gratitude. Another envelope came, this one from the Department of the Army's Office of Military Records. After a public inquiry prompted by the incident, Frank's personnel file had been reopened. Buried within was a long overlooked action report from February 1968, Con Vietnam, documenting how Staff Sergeant Frank Delaney had single-handedly pulled 6 wounded Marines from a burning vehicle under heavy enemy fire, his knee already shattered by shrapnel. The report, once lost in the chaos of war, was now restored. A handwritten note from General James E. Lockhart accompanied the file. "Frank the Primper was Corporal Turber 3 in that vehicle. You don't know me, but I've known you every day since. I'm alive because of what you did. I made it home. I made a family. I made a life. All because a Marine who limped worse than me refused to let go. Thank you. You were never invisible, not to us." Frank sat with the letter for a long time, words unnecessary. Elsewhere, Charlotte Hayes typed steadily on her laptop, telling the story as it had unfolded, plain, honest, and true. It was picked up by regional news, then national outlets, becoming a symbol, read aloud in schools and displayed in veterans of foreign wars halls across the country. Frank Delaney returned to his life in Rock Springs, still drinking his coffee, Black, still limping to the mailbox each morning. But something had shifted deep inside him. He walked with a quiet dignity, no longer weighed down by the feeling of being forgotten. At dusk, sitting on his porch as the sun dipped behind the Wyoming hills, he smiled not from pride, but because for the first time in a long while he was truly seen. And so a seat became more than a seat. It became a testament to honor, a symbol of sacrifice, and a reminder that even in the quietest places, kindness and respect can rise again. As the last light faded behind the hills, the memory lingered, some voices once heard never fade. The days that followed the flight unfolded like a steady tide carrying Frank Delaney's story far beyond the cabin walls of that plane. News outlets picked up the account of the veteran forced from his medically necessary seat and the captain's public apology. The tale became a beacon reminding many of the quiet sacrifices borne by those who served and the respect long overdue. Back in Rock Springs, Wyoming, Frank found his routine touched by something new. Greetings from neighbors carried with a deeper warmth, nods from strangers held a reverence previously absent. Yet amid the recognition, he remained modest. His life was unchanged in its simplicity. Black coffee each morning, the slow limp to the mailbox, the worn porch steps at dusk. But something subtle had shifted. His shoulders held a steadier line. His gaze carried a light that hadn't been there before. One afternoon, a letter arrived from the Transcontinental Airlines Veterans Council. It designated Frank as a lifetime guest of honor. No more fees, no more hurdles when booking. Just tell us where you're going, and we'll get you there, the card read. It was a gesture of gratitude that touched Frank deeply, yet he tucked it away quietly, a private acknowledgement of a public moment. Then came another letter, this one from the Department of the Army, reopening a file long forgotten. The report within detailed an act of valor in Vietnam, how Frank had saved 6 wounded Marines from a burning vehicle, despite a shattered knee. A handwritten note accompanied the report, a message from a man who owed his life to Frank's courage. The words were simple but profound. You were never invisible, not to us. Frank reread the letter, often feeling the weight of those words settle into his heart. The sacrifices he had carried in silence were now spoken aloud, recognized not just by institutions, but by those whose lives he had touched. Across the country, Charlotte Hayes continued her work as a storyteller, ensuring Frank's narrative reached schools, veterans' halls, and community centers. His image, a weathered man seated with quiet dignity, became a symbol of honor and remembrance. It reminded others that courage is often silent and respect must be earned and upheld every day. One evening, as Frank sat on his porch watching the Wyoming sun dip low behind the hills, his granddaughter joined him. They spoke of her commissioning her hopes and the legacy she would carry forward. Frank listened, his heart swelling with pride, knowing that the torch had been passed. The world had remembered Frank Delaney, and in remembering it had restored more than a seat, it had restored a man's dignity, his story, and the enduring spirit of honor. As the night settled and the stars above twinkled steadily, a quiet reminder that even the smallest light can shine through the darkest times. In the weeks and months that followed, Frank Delaney's story became more than a single flight. It grew into a lasting legacy that touched communities far beyond Annapolis and Rock Springs. The photograph of Frank seated in first class, with his weathered hands resting calmly on his knees, circulated widely. It hung on the walls of Veterans of Foreign Wars halls, appeared in school assemblies, and was shared across social media platforms as a symbol of respect, sacrifice, and quiet dignity. Transcontinental Airlines took steps to ensure no veteran would ever face the same hardship. New policies were enacted to prioritize medically necessary seating, and staff received training to better recognize and honor the sacrifices of those who served. Frank's designation as a lifetime guest of honor was more than a title. It was a commitment, a promise etched into the company's culture. Frank himself remained unchanged in many ways. He still drank his coffee, black limped to the mailbox each morning, and watched the Wyoming sunsets from his porch. But there was a new lightness in his step, a subtle strength born from being truly seen and honored. The letters from old comrades, the public recognition, and the quiet smiles of strangers all wove together to affirm a truth he had carried silently for decades: he mattered. In a quiet home office in Richmond, Virginia, Charlotte Hayes continued to write her words, honoring the invisible heroes like Frank, who shaped history without fanfare. She believed that every story deserved to be told, that justice lived in the act of remembrance, and that kindness, even in its smallest forms, could change a life. One evening, as Frank sat beneath a sky painted with stars, he looked up and felt a profound sense of peace. The sacrifices, the pain, the years of quiet endurance, all had led to this moment of recognition. A seat on a plane had become a symbol not just of comfort, but of honor restored. And in that quiet night, the legacy of Staff Sergeant Frank Delaney was clear. No act of courage, no sacrifice, no silent heroism is ever truly forgotten. History may sometimes stay silent, but when a voice finally speaks, it echoes for generations. For Frank and for all who have served, that echo would never fade. As the wind whispered through the Wyoming pines, a single truth remained. Dignity is not given lightly, but once earned, it lives on forever. Frank followed Charlotte through the wide glass doors of the Seattle Museum of Flight, the sunlight bouncing off the polished floor in quiet celebration of everything that had brought him here. Their footfalls echoed beneath soaring aircraft, suspended like steel birds in mid-song, but he hardly noticed the planes. Tucked near a corner gallery was a modest alcove of walnut and brass, a neatly pressed airline uniform displayed beside a battered pair of wooden crutches, a photograph of Frank seated in first class, and a slender plaque that gleamed like a new medal. Charlotte had insisted on this stop, promising only that he would want to see what they've done. Now he stood before the exhibit, the glass panel reflecting his present self, while the image inside preserved a past moment of grace. A captain bent in apology, a former sergeant accepting dignity the world once forgot. For a long while, Frank simply watched the reflection of his own face dividing and reuniting with the man behind the glass, as if time itself surrendered to the quiet lunch break hush of the gallery. He lifted a hand to the barrier fingertips, just shy of touching the cool surface, and felt the gentle resistance of memory pressing back. Charlotte hung back far enough to grant him privacy, but the lens of her camera rested lightly against her chest, ready. She had fought for this display, had written emails and lobbied curators until they agreed that a single seat on a commercial flight could symbolize something far larger than legroom. Frank traced the engraved words with his eyes. Every journey carries stories that fly farther than any aircraft. The sentence felt simultaneously grand and intimate, like hearing your own whisper inside a cathedral. Around them, occasional visitors drifted past, pausing when they recognized the man in the frame, and the man beside it were one and the same. Some offered nods, some murmured thanks, none intruded. The museum lighting warmed the plaque so it glowed against the darker paneling, and Frank remembered flares over caisson tracer rounds, skipping across night the strange beauty of destruction. This glow was different, no roar, no chaos, only a soft promise that peace could also illuminate a life. He became aware of Charlotte at his shoulder camera, now raised, capturing the moment his reflection merged with the photograph present and past, blending into a single silhouette on the glass. He didn't flinch at the click. Instead, he turned to her and smiled a quiet, "You were right" grin. Charlotte lowered the camera, eyes bright. "Future passengers will see this," she said, voice hushed by respect. "They'll remember that kindness belongs in the sky." Frank nodded, imagining a young flight attendant, someday pausing here, reading the story, deciding that no veteran or any passenger should ever feel erased. Maybe that intention would ripple outward, subtle, as contrails melting into blue. He slid his hand into the pocket of his tan jacket and closed his fingers around the small flag pin he carried, reassured by its familiar shape. Outside the museum, evening light draped Seattle in amber. Charlotte drove while Frank watched cedar tops blur past the window, his vision layering museum glass over treetops, plaque over clouds, forging a gentle collage of then and now. When Charlotte asked if he was all right, he answered, "I'm exactly where I need to be." They shared the interstate with trucks thundering toward distant ports, and Frank thought of all the cargo unseen letters, photographs, folded flags, each bearing its own testament across the continent. In his lap, the guest of honor card from Transcontinental Airlines felt less like a ticket and more like a bridge linking one act of recognition to the next. He did not know where it would lead. He only knew the journey mattered. Weeks later, the Wyoming dawn found Frank awake before the first meadowlark. The air was thin and chill-scented with sage and dew, and the horizon shimmered with the faintest promise of gold. He filled the old kettle, brewed black coffee, and carried the steaming mug onto the porch, where his rocking chair waited like a steadfast friend. The hills lay dusky purple, the sky a deep indigo smeared with ash-pink streaks that would soon ignite into full daylight. He settled carefully the familiar ache in his knee, an echo of responsibilities kept, and balanced the cup on the flat of his palm to warm his fingers. The guest of honor card rested on the side table beneath a Riverstone paperweight, but it was not the destination of his gaze. Instead, he watched the slow unfurling of morning, every second a brushstroke, every rustle of wind through the pines a hymn. Inside, pinned to the kitchen corkboard, the Naval Academy commissioning date shone in bold ink. He had circled it with a decisive blue line the morning after returning from Washington, surprising himself with the certainty of that gesture. It felt different from marking medical appointments or supply runs. This was a beacon. His granddaughter would soon trade midshipman white for the stripes of an ensign, and he would be there when her sword left its scabbard to salute a life of service still ahead. The thought steadied him like another brace, invisible yet firm. He sipped coffee and listened to the hush of High Plains wind. Somewhere down the road, cattle would stir, and the town courthouse flag would crack awake. But in this pause before sunrise, the world belonged to possibility alone. A screen door creaked inside as the house settled. He pictured letters stacked on the hallway table. Charlotte had promised to forward new messages from families reunited with long-lost flags. In the days after Tacoma, her photograph of Frank and the return banner had swept through veteran networks, sparking a wave of quiet detective work. Strangers combed attics, old barracks, base archives, searching for misplaced relics of folded cloth and stars. Each success story dropped into Frank's mailbox like a bright coin, evidence that remembrance could travel farther than neglect. He finished his coffee just as the sun breached a distant ridge, spilling molten copper across the grasslands. Shadows fled, leaving dew beads to sparkle, and the tips of the pines caught fire in brilliant orange for a heartbeat before settling into steady green. Frank inhaled, lungs expanding with crisp air tinged by pine resin, and felt a hush of gratitude spread through his chest. The rocking chair creaked beneath him, matching the rhythm of his breath. He wasn't surprised when a delivery truck rattled down the gravel lane and stopped at his gate. Even the timing had begun to feel destined. The driver placed a padded envelope beside the mailbox, then lifted a hand in respectful greeting before rolling away. Frank retrieved the package, noting Charlotte's familiar looping script on the label. Inside lay a glossy magazine-proof next month's feature story, his portrait beneath museum glass on the cover article headline, declaring, "No seat too small for honor." He skimmed Charlotte's introduction, eyes catching on phrases like legacy of compassion and the unseen carry us forward. At the end, she had slipped a short, handwritten note. They're already building a training module called the Delaney Protocol. You didn't just change a policy, you've changed hearts. See you at graduation, keep that window seat. He tucked the note into his wallet beside medals and bus passes from long ago, then returned to the porch. The sky now glowed full rose and gold, the day revealed in sweeping clarity. Frank leaned back, knees eased by the angle of the rocker, and allowed the warmth to soak through the sleeve of his tan jacket. He thought of the museum glass, of Charlotte's camera of flags raised and returned, of an airline promise, and an unbroken chain of gratitude looping back to him again and again. Somewhere above a departing flight carved a silver line across the brightening blue engines, a distant murmur. He followed that line until it faded, imagined strangers, onboard students, grandparents, soldiers, perhaps a weary veteran heading home, each soul deserving of dignity at altitude and on earth. With one last steady breath, Frank rose, folded the magazine beneath his arm, and stepped off the porch into the newborn light, the horizon wide open before him like a runway without end.